In the silent depths of an Istanbul dawn in 1623, the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace trembled with a sound no court musician had composed, no muezzin had called. It was not the clash of swords, nor the thunder of cannons echoing across the Bosphorus. It was a single scream, heart-rending and sharp, slicing through the perfumed air of the imperial chambers. Some claimed it belonged to Princess Fatima Sultan, barely 15 years old, a girl whose name glittered in the registers of power, yet who remained a child of flesh and fear. That scream, if it truly existed, never made its way into the ornate chronicles of the empire. The official scribes, with their gilded ink and obedient pens, recorded victories, births, coronations. They did not record the cries of daughters, yet the rumor lingered, whispered by eunuchs, carried on the lips of servants, repeated with a shudder by foreign envoys who claimed to know too much. Fatima was the daughter of Sultan Ahmed IV, sovereign of one of the mightiest realms on earth. She had grown among gardens scented with jasmine and roses, attended by tutors who marveled at her intellect. But in the palace, privilege came bound to a hidden cost. From the moment a princess neared marriageable age, a shadow fell upon her. Some called it destiny, others a curse woven into the silk of her lineage. The scream, whether real or embroidered by gossip, was said to mark the first act of a ritual no chronicler dared describe. Behind veils of silk and layers of ceremony, young brides of the Ottoman dynasty were prepared for a future not of choice, but of obedience. Their cries were muffled, their identities molded, their wills bent toward submission. Even the eunuchs, guardians hardened to cruelty, were said to lower their eyes, unwilling to confront what they heard in those golden corridors. For them, duty meant silence. For the princess, silence became a chain. Before we continue, storytellers might pause here to invite you closer, as if to whisper across centuries. Think of the paradox. In an empire that projected magnificence from the walls of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, its greatest sacrifices were not always on battlefields. Sometimes they were hidden in chambers where the enemy was not an army but fear itself. Whether fact or legend, accounts insist that this was the hidden price every daughter of a sultan paid upon reaching womanhood. A price written not in decrees or treaties, but in whispers, etched on the skin of memory. The official histories remain silent, but palace gossip spoke of a preparation so secret it became myth. Some called it a ritual of sacred instruction. Others, a training that broke the spirit before the body. Behind the veils of silk and the rose-scented fountains lay something darker than any European princess could have imagined. For centuries the rumor persisted. The empire perfected a marriage protocol so cruel that not even its fiercest enemies would have wished it upon their daughters. Chroniclers never admitted to such practices, yet the people, servants, merchants, even foreign ambassadors, kept telling the story, as though refusing to let silence win. Later generations spoke of forbidden documents hidden in Istanbul's archives, parchments that supposedly revealed what truly happened on the wedding nights of Ottoman princesses. Were they authentic records, or clever forgeries designed to scandalize? No one can say for certain. But the very existence of the rumor, its persistence across centuries, tells us something about the anxieties of that gilded world. For while peasants and noblewomen alike dreamed of palace life, imagining fountains, jewels, and luxury, the imperial daughters often faced nightmares disguised as grandeur. This is no fairy tale. It is a tale stitched together from history and rumor, fact and fear. Princesses born in marble palaces were not always envied. Sometimes they were pitied, and many, if the whispers are true, preferred the cold embrace of the grave to the destiny awaiting them beyond the bridal door. The story of Fatima Sultan begins here, with a scream echoing through the dawn of Istanbul, a sound that history tried to bury but memory refused to forget. The Ottoman Empire dazzled the world with its ceremonies. When a princess was married, the empire wanted all of Istanbul to witness the splendor. Golden processions winding through the streets, jeweled fabrics shimmering in torchlight, fountains running with sherbet, drums and flutes filling the air. To the people who lined the avenues, it looked like the highest form of fortune. What girl could dream of anything greater than becoming a bride in the house of Osman? But whispers told a different story. Behind the polished facade of public festivals, imperial daughters faced a price so heavy that no wealth could lighten it. While European princesses might be bartered across borders for alliances, they still carried a degree of ceremony, correspondence, and in some cases, influence of their own. In the Ottoman court, the daughters of sultans were rarely envied. Their marriages were tools of politics, not chapters of love. And while Europe celebrated its royal brides as symbols of diplomacy, Istanbul's palace walls hid the trembling figures of girls who had no voice in the matter. Storytellers whispered of a ritual, a protocol, perfected over generations, designed not for their happiness, but for their submission. Some insisted it was so cruel, so exacting, that even the fiercest enemies of the empire would not have inflicted it on their daughters. Yet, the official histories remained silent, as though the screams of young women could not disturb the empire's illusion of grandeur. And still the stories survived. Travelers spoke of shadowed rooms, of attendants guiding girls through strange rehearsals. Foreign merchants, barred from the palace, filled their letters with tales they heard in taverns, that Ottoman princesses were broken before they were given to husbands, reshaped until their pride was gone. European readers devoured such rumors eagerly. Whether true or not, they reinforced their own belief that the East was cruel, exotic, and dangerous. But for those within the palace walls, the rumor had a sharper edge. Servants repeated it in low voices, not to condemn, but to explain the haunted eyes of the princesses they served. Centuries later, writers claimed to have glimpsed forbidden documents hidden in Istanbul's archives, letters, reports, or even coded ledgers that supposedly revealed what truly occurred in those days of preparation. Were they genuine, or clever forgeries crafted to stir scandal in the salons of Paris and London? No one knows. But the power of the rumor lay not in its certainty, but in its persistence. Because even if the details were distorted, the essence rang true. Behind the brocaded curtains and the thunder of ceremonial drums, daughters of the empire were not spared suffering. Their silks did not protect them. Their jewels did not comfort them. Their rank, their very bloodline, became the instrument of their captivity. And so the paradox sharpened. Outside the palace gates, the empire projected magnificence, its armies disciplined as iron, its mosques piercing the sky, its rulers celebrated as shadow caliphs. Inside, in the most private of chambers, young girls carried the hidden cost of that power. Their stories, unrecorded in chronicles, slipped instead into the cracks of rumor and myth, surviving in whispers, half-truths, and the memory of pain. It was in this silence, this space between history and legend, that Fatima Sultan's fate was sealed. The Ottoman Empire stretched like a tide over 3 continents, from the walls of Vienna in the west to the deserts of Arabia in the south, and from the steppes of Hungary down to the shores of Yemen. From its founding in 1299 until its final collapse in 1922, it was one of the longest-lasting dynasties the world had ever seen, a machine of politics, religion, and conquest that bent nations to its rhythm. When Constantinople fell in 1453, it was not merely the conquest of a city. It was the end of Byzantium, the rebirth of Istanbul as the empire's heart, and the beginning of a new world order. Minarets rose where domes of Christendom had once stood. Caravan routes and sea lanes now flowed toward the Bosphorus, carrying silks, spices, and soldiers. The city became a living artery through which the empire pulsed. At its center gleamed Topkapi Palace, perched like a crown above the meeting of seas. Within its walls, decisions were made that shook the balance of kingdoms. Wars declared, alliances forged, heirs chosen. Yet Topkapi was more than a stage for diplomacy and power. It was also a labyrinth of shadows, where the private tragedies of royal blood played out behind guarded gates. The palace itself was a paradox. From the outside, it was an emblem of control and magnificence. Marble courts lined with fountains, jeweled pavilions overlooking the waters, libraries filled with books copied by the finest calligraphers. But from within, the same marble walls became cages, the same jeweled pavilions became prisons for those whose birth chained them to the throne's demands. And it was within those walls that silence reigned. Not the silence of peace, but the silence enforced by hierarchy. Eunuchs, black-clad and watchful, guarded every doorway, carrying with them both fear and discipline. Concubines, musicians, scribes, all knew the price of a careless word. And for the daughters of the Sultan, silence became their inheritance. Every whisper about their fate reminded courtiers that while the empire projected unstoppable power abroad, it hid its most delicate cruelties at home. This was the contradiction of Ottoman magnificence. In public, gold and steel; in private, tears and resignation. Fatima Sultan's story belongs to this paradox. She was born into the zenith of imperial glory, yet destined to be consumed by its hidden rituals. Her tragedy, like so many before her, was the invisible foundation on which the empire's grandeur rested. Behind the gilded gates of Topkapi stood a city within a city, the imperial harem. To outsiders, it was a mystery cloaked in rumor and fantasy, a place where beauty and desire reigned. To those inside, it was a machine of order, discipline, and fear. At its height, the harem held more than 800 women, bound by strict rules that governed their every glance, step, and breath. For most of the empire's history, the harem was not simply a place of pleasure, as outsiders imagined, but an institution woven into the very fabric of power. Within its high walls, alliances were forged, loyalties tested, and futures decided. The women lived in carefully tiered hierarchies, concubines at the bottom, favorites and consorts in the middle, and at the peak, the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, whose word carried weight even over ministers of state. From the 1530s onward, the harem's influence deepened. Sultan Suleiman, remembered as the Magnificent, gave his wife Hürrem Sultan unprecedented authority. With that, the harem shifted from a gilded enclosure to a theatre of intrigue. The period that followed became known as the Sultanate of Women, a century in which women like Kösem Sultan and Turhan Hatice Sultan held genuine power. They maneuvered through assassinations, rebellions, and foreign wars, shaping the destiny of the empire from behind veils and latticed screens. But not all women of the harem shared this chance at influence. Concubines, often Christian slaves seized in raids or purchased in distant markets, sometimes climbed the ranks by catching the sultan's eye. Some transformed their bondage into authority, their children into heirs. For them, the harem was dangerous, but it offered the possibility of power. The daughters of the sultan, however, lived under a harsher fate. Unlike concubines, they could not rise through charm or wit. Their destiny was fixed from birth. They were pieces on the chessboard of imperial politics, pawns bartered in marriage to secure the loyalty of governors, generals, or rival dynasties. Every smile, every promise of silk and jewels concealed the truth. They were sacrifices to the throne. It was in this double world of grandeur and oppression that the story of Fatima Sultan unfolded. Her mother, Kösem Sultan, was among the most powerful women the empire ever produced, but even she could not shield her daughter from the role inscribed upon her. For while concubines might rise to queenly heights, princesses were born to endure. Their lineage was not their crown, it was their chain. And so, within the perfumed gardens and echoing marble halls, a darker reality thrived. Imperial women became both architects of power and its victims. For Fatima, this meant her life was already set upon rails that led not to freedom, but to a ritual of submission few dared name aloud. In 1606, the palace bells rang softly, and the cry of a newborn echoed through Topkapi. Fatima Sultan had entered the world, daughter of Sultan Ahmed I and the formidable Kösem Sultan. To the empire, she was a jewel in the dynasty's crown, proof that the line of Osman endured. To her mother, she was another piece in a dangerous game, a game Kösem herself had mastered better than most. Fatima's childhood was lived in the most exquisite of cages. She played in courtyards where fountains murmured beside the verses of poets, where musicians strummed the oud under cypress trees, and where exotic animals were paraded for the amusement of royal children. Her world shimmered with silk and perfume, yet even in her earliest years, she would have known that every eye upon her was measuring her worth to the empire. Chroniclers admired her brilliance. She spoke with the clarity of a scholar, learned 4 languages before adolescence, and handled the reed pen of the calligrapher with precision. She studied astronomy, mapping the stars that glittered above the domes of Istanbul, and she debated law and history with teachers brought from the corners of the empire. To poets, she was celebrated as a radiant pearl of the dynasty, her intelligence, beauty, and nobility gathered in a single figure. These gifts, however, were not shields. In the Ottoman court, talent was admired, but rarely allowed to change destiny. A princess might shine in gardens, but her brilliance belonged to others. Each accomplishment of Fatima's became another embellishment for the dynasty, another reminder that she was born not for herself, but for the empire's use. Her mother, Kosem, must have known this better than anyone. As Valide Sultan, she wielded real power. She brokered alliances, commanded loyalty from Janissaries, and influenced the throne itself. Yet even she, the Shadow Queen, could not untangle her daughter from the web of dynastic strategy. The empire demanded sacrifices, and a princess was one of its most precious offerings. To the poets, Fatima was a jewel. To her tutors, a prodigy. To her mother, perhaps a beloved child. But to the empire, she was already a tool of diplomacy, her name quietly written into the scrolls of future alliances. Long before she could choose, her life had been chosen for her. From the moment Fatima Sultan was born, her path was carved in stone. Daughters of sultans did not dream their own futures. They were written into treaties and sealed with signatures long before their wedding veils were ever drawn. Each imperial princess was a bargaining piece, a living contract between throne and subject, between dynasty and general. Fatima's fate was no different. Her name, inscribed silently but firmly upon the scrolls of strategy, meant she would be bartered to secure the obedience of a powerful man or to bind a rival family closer to the throne. Her brilliance, her beauty, her talents, none of these mattered. What mattered was whose loyalty her body could purchase for the empire. The man chosen for her was not a young noble or a romantic suitor from the gardens of the court. It was Kara Mustafa Pasha, a commander of hardened campaigns, older by nearly 2 decades. To him, marriage to a sultan's daughter was not romance, but a coronation of another kind, a ladder to power, a guarantee of proximity to the dynasty itself. For Fatima, this decision was the beginning of a tragedy. She had been raised in the perfumed gardens of Topkapi, educated in languages, astronomy, and poetry, praised for her wit and her grace. None of this shielded her from the cold reality that her worth to the empire would be measured in obedience and in her ability to seal alliances. Even Kosem Sultan, her formidable mother, once a concubine herself who had risen to become the most powerful woman in the empire, could not protect her. Kosem had survived palace intrigues, assassinations, and the violent tides of politics. Yet against the machinery of dynastic necessity, even her influence faltered. To spare Fatima would be to appear weak, to betray the empire's carefully crafted image of control. And so the Shadow Queen, master of intrigue, stood powerless against the ancient weight of tradition. This is what it meant to be a princess of the House of Osman, to be born into splendor, only to be handed over as a symbol. Fatima, who once debated scholars and charted the stars, was now reduced to a pawn in a game that had no place for her dreams. In the months before her marriage, Fatima Sultan was said to have been subjected to preparations known by whispered names, Turvil and Mubarak. To the court scribes, these were described as sacred instructions, a form of bridal education. But among the attendants and eunuchs, the truth was spoken more plainly. It was a mechanism of submission, designed to break the will of a girl before she was handed to her husband. The ritual, if rumor is to be believed, was overseen by an elderly attendant named Gulnar Hatun. She had served the harem for decades, carrying the knowledge of its customs like an invisible chain of inheritance. To Fatima, she became less tutor than warden. The bridal chamber was transformed into her classroom, a stage for endless repetition. Each day, Fatima practiced bows of precise angles, her body bent into postures of humility. She was taught to walk with measured steps, hands lowered, her eyes cast down. Her vocabulary, once rich with poetry and the sharp turns of debate, was cut down to 4 permitted words: gratitude, apology, acceptance, supplication. She repeated them like prayers until her tongue no longer reached for anything else. Every error brought punishment. If her bow was not low enough, she was ordered to fast. If her words faltered, she was confined in silence. Witnesses, whether real or imagined in the chronicles of later writers, spoke of a process that recorded her every movement, as though her compliance were being measured like a soldier's drills. And here lies the cruel paradox. In an empire that revered learning, that built libraries of dazzling manuscripts, that celebrated poets and scholars, a princess of its dynasty was stripped of her very ability to think and speak freely. The same girl who once debated law with tutors was reduced to a shadow repeating words of obedience. These practices may never appear in official registers, but they fit the deeper truth of palace life. The Ottoman system prized control above all. Just as janissaries were trained from boyhood to erase their former identities and become servants of the state, so too were princesses molded into silent instruments of diplomacy. For Fatima, the training was not a preparation for marriage. It was an erasure of self. If Fatima's daily lessons of bows and measured words seemed cruel, whispers told of an even darker preparation carried out away from the gilded light of the palace. Chroniclers, always careful to cloak their accounts in rumor and hearsay, spoke of rehearsals conducted in underground chambers, where the girl was made to mimic gestures no adolescent should ever know. The tools of this rehearsal were said to be wax figures, crafted by Venetian artisans, imported under the guise of artistry, but turned to a different purpose. Fatima, barely past childhood, was forced to practice movements that belonged not to innocence, but to submission. Each tremor of resistance was noted, each hesitation recorded in secret ledgers. The eunuchs and attendants, their faces impassive, watched as though judging not a princess, but a soldier in training. Were these tales truth, exaggeration, or invention by later storytellers seeking scandal? Historians hesitate. No official record has ever confirmed them. And yet the persistence of the rumor across centuries speaks to its symbolic power. For even if no wax figure ever stood in those chambers, the idea of them reveals the hidden terror of palace life, that a girl's body could be treated as theatre, her dignity rehearsed away like lines in a play. One must remember, too, the climate of Istanbul in those years. Foreign ambassadors competed for gossip as eagerly as for trade privileges. A whisper overheard by a servant might grow into a report carried to Venice, to Paris, to Vienna, embroidered with each retelling. The Ottomans themselves, protective of the palace's secrets, allowed silence to fester, which only fed speculation. And yet, even if half the stories were inventions, the truth they concealed was just as haunting. Fatima's final months before marriage were marked by humiliation. Accounts insist she was even ordered to serve her father's concubines, washing them, dressing them, preparing them for nights with the Sultan. To see her tears fall as she adjusted their veils was, for many servants, a memory too sharp to forget. Thus the rumors of wax figures, whether real or imagined, became more than scandal. They became the emblem of her tragedy, for they spoke of a princess rehearsing not for joy, not for power, but for surrender. By this stage, humiliation had become the foundation of Fatima Sultan's days. Accounts, half history, half whispered memory, recall how she was forced to serve her father's concubines. She fetched water for their baths, fastened the clasps of their gowns, adjusted their veils before they were led to Sultan Ahmed's chambers. For a princess born of royal blood, it was degradation made ritual. The message was unmistakable. Even her father's mistresses stood above her in rank. Her punishments were carefully measured. A defiant glance could condemn her to days of fasting. A sigh, overheard by attendants, might send her into the damp reflection cells where silence and darkness pressed like iron against her spirit. The cells were small, lined with mirrors, forcing her to confront her own face until her pride withered. If she stumbled over a bow or faltered in a prayer, she was made to repeat the gesture for hours before the female court until exhaustion erased all trace of resistance. Even her education, once a realm of poetry and stars, was stripped and reshaped. Astronomy gave way to manuals of obedience, her calligraphy now used to copy passages from treatises like Nasihat al-Muluk, works that extolled loyalty, sacrifice, and subjugation as sacred duties. Where once she wrote poems to the night sky, she now traced words that bound her to silence. Religion itself was turned into a tool of submission. No longer did her prayers rise freely to God, as they had in her youth. Instead, her recitations were twisted into formulas glorifying devotion to a future husband, as if obedience to him was obedience to the divine. What had once been a source of solace became a rehearsal of captivity. Witnesses, or perhaps storytellers determined to preserve her suffering, claimed that every detail of her progress was logged, as though she were undergoing an examination. Yet there were no grades, no moments of triumph, only the certainty that her training would continue until her will was broken entirely. Those who remembered her from her childhood spoke of a cruel transformation. The young woman who had once debated scholars with wit and courage now seemed to fade. Her laughter disappeared, her sharp words dulled. It was not merely fear that silenced her. It was as though her voice itself had been taken from her, leaving behind only a shadow of the brilliant girl she had once been. A week before her wedding, Fatima Sultan was moved into the Helin Köşk, the bridal pavilion. Isolated from the rest of the palace, it was a compound designed not for comfort, but for control. Every surface, every ritual, every sound carried a single message. She no longer belonged to herself. From the moment she crossed its threshold, even her meals became part of the ritual. Chroniclers record a diet of pomegranates, honey, goat's milk, almonds, and spiced elixirs. Some whispered these mixtures came from recipes traced back to Cordoba or Samarkand, devised by alchemists to calm the spirit and make the body docile. Others dismissed them as mere rumor, but the effect, whether real or imagined, was undeniable. Fatima began to sink into a strange resignation, as if each bite were a step deeper into silence. Bathing, too, was transformed into ordeal. Under the watch of attendants, she was immersed in waters perfumed with poppy oil, valerian, and asafoetida. What should have been refreshing became ritual purification, her skin prepared not for herself, but for her future husband. Witnesses later described the baths as sacred acts, turned into invisible chains, the empire asserting its claim over her very flesh. Even the walls of the pavilion seemed to conspire against her. Tapestries depicted obedient wives rewarded with fertility and submission, silent models for Fatima to imitate. Phoenician mirrors were positioned so that she could not escape her own reflection. What had once been a Sufi practice of muraqaba, self-observation for spiritual growth, was twisted into punishment, forcing her to confront herself until she seemed to vanish into the reflection. Her education, once a joy of poetry and astronomy, was reduced to endless recitations from obedience manuals. Attendants handed her texts like Nasihat al-Muluk, urging her to proclaim loyalty, humility, and self-sacrifice aloud until her voice grew hoarse. Even her prayers were reshaped, no longer intimate supplications to God, but formulas glorifying devotion to her husband as if it were divine command. Faith itself was bent into a rehearsal of obedience. The humiliation deepened in subtle ways. Twice each week she was still ordered to serve her father's concubines, a ritual reminder that she had no rank of her own. Attendants recorded her every movement as if she were an experiment in submission. The punishments for resistance remained relentless: fasting, confinement, darkness, endless repetition. By this stage, those who knew her said her voice had nearly vanished. The girl who once debated scholars now seemed unable to find words at all. Her brilliance had not merely been muted, it had been hollowed out. The bridal pavilion had done its work. Fatima, once a prodigy of wit and spirit, now moved like a shadow within its walls, a vessel prepared for obedience. As the wedding day drew near, Fatima Sultan's world contracted to the narrow boundaries of the bridal pavilion. The last week was designed as a crucible, a final stripping away of self before she was delivered into marriage. No sound from outside was allowed to reach her, no laughter from the gardens, no calls of merchants from the city, no voice except the commands of her attendants. The silence itself became a weapon, pressing in on her like a suffocating cloak. Her days unfolded with mechanical precision. Dawn prayers, supervised baths, carefully measured meals, then hours of recitations, obedience texts, invocations of loyalty, and endless repetitions of vows until her body no longer resisted, but bent automatically. At night, she lay beneath embroidered ceilings that seemed to press down with the weight of every obedient wife depicted in tapestries around her. Punishments grew harsher. A flicker of defiance could send her into the reflection cells, small stone chambers where her only company was the echo of her breath and her own mirrored image staring back. The mirrors distorted her, multiplying her figure into 100 silent witnesses of her own despair. Attendants called it muraqaba, a form of meditation, but to Fatima it was erasure. Her diet, already ritualized, grew stranger. Almonds and honey mixed with bitter syrups, said to calm the heart. Goat's milk thickened with herbs to dull resistance. Whether these were true alchemical concoctions or merely symbolic, the effect was the same. Her body weakened, her spirit sank into resignation. By then, those who remembered her brilliance spoke of a girl transformed. The once radiant child who argued with scholars and traced constellations now moved through her days in silence. She did not merely refrain from speaking out of fear, she seemed unable to form words at all. The final days were perhaps the most cruel. Fatima was made to repeat ceremonies of supplication before concubines and eunuchs, bowing until her limbs shook, reciting prayers until exhaustion forced her into stillness. The rituals erased not only her will, but her identity. By the end of that week, she no longer resembled the child who had laughed among fountains, or the young woman praised by poets. She had been reshaped into something else, a vessel of obedience, stripped of voice, prepared to endure the night that awaited her. It was in this silence, within the walls of the bridal pavilion, that the last fragments of her spirit were dimmed. Fatima Sultan, once a prodigy of brilliance, had become a shadow rehearsed into submission. The appointed day arrived, March 15th, 1623. While the city stirred with the freshness of spring, Istanbul awoke to spectacle. From dawn until dusk, the empire staged a performance meant to dazzle both its subjects and its rivals. The streets filled with processions, soldiers in gleaming armor, pages carrying silken banners, guilds parading their crafts as if the marriage of a princess were a festival for all trades. Incense thickened the air until it clung to the skin. War drums pounded, joined by the trembling strings of ouds and the bright calls of trumpets. Courtyards within Topkapi glittered with banquets served on golden trays, their surfaces crowded with sherbets, candied fruits, and roasted meats perfumed with saffron. Chroniclers describe dancers from Persia swaying in jewel-toned silks, while Andalusian musicians played melodies carried from the farthest corners of empire. The Janissaries too performed, their martial drills reminding all that power was not only dressed in gold, but forged in steel. To the people, this day was a triumph, a union between blood and sword, heaven and empire. They raised their cups and blessed the Sultan's daughter, believing her life would now be a string of jewels, a tale of silks and happiness. But for Fatima Sultan, this was not celebration. It was doom wrapped in music. Physicians at the palace noticed what others missed. Her lips cracked, her eyes glassy, her hands trembled despite the mild air. She ate little, drank less. Today we might call it a panic attack. Then it was labeled virginal melancholy, a vague diagnosis meant to hide what could not be spoken. Amidst the clamor of music and the clinking of goblets, she remained still, her gaze unfixed, her silence heavier than the feasts around her. She was not the jewel everyone praised. She was a prisoner awaiting judgment. And when the feasts ended, when the streets emptied and the guests withdrew, the most dreaded procession began. Fatima was to be led not into celebration, but into the bridal pavilion, into the chamber where spectacle gave way to silence and grandeur to fear. As twilight fell, the jubilant noise of Istanbul faded into the muffled drumbeat of ceremony. Fatima Sultan, pale and trembling, was led from her pavilion. Physicians recorded her weakness, her lips dry, her body trembling despite the mild air. What we would now call anxiety or trauma was then dismissed as huzun-i bikr, the sorrow of maidenhood, a phrase that veiled suffering in poetry. The rituals began with purification. Fatima was bathed once more, this time in rosewater mixed with sandalwood oil. Attendants anointed her skin with heavy ointments until her body glistened as though gilded. To outsiders, it was the sacred cleansing of a bride. To her, it was one more stripping away of self. Water turned into empire's claim over her flesh. Rumors whispered of stronger concoctions, drops of opium to soften her fear, or mandrake to dull resistance. Whether true or not, the suggestion alone reveals how little her will mattered. What mattered was the performance of obedience. Then came the dressing. Fatima was clothed in a gown of white silk embroidered with gold thread, so heavy with pearls and gemstones that it weighed upon her shoulders like a chain. To the crowds who glimpsed her, it was majesty itself, the radiance of a sultan's daughter. Yet some whispered that the gown's weight and stiff layers were a prison of cloth, forcing her into stillness. When she emerged, she looked the perfect vision of Ottoman splendor, an icon, not a girl. But beneath the veil, her breath quickened, and her silence screamed louder than any voice. Meanwhile, in another chamber, Kara Mustafa Pasha prepared for the union. He was counseled by elder statesmen on his conduct, as though a wedding night were a campaign to be executed. Some accounts suggest he was instructed to assert dominance, to establish authority from the first moment. Whether fact or embellishment, the notion reveals how marriage in the empire was not merely private. It was dynastic, political, an extension of conquest. Thus, bride and groom were prepared in parallel, she for obedience, he for command. And when the procession reached its end, Fatima was carried into the bridal chamber, an octagonal structure within the gardens, its walls draped in tapestries of victories, as if to remind her that even here, politics and empire held sway. At last, the doors of the bridal chamber closed. The air was heavy with incense, the flicker of oil lamps casting shadows across tapestries that depicted conquests and triumphs. Even in this most intimate of spaces, Fatima Sultan was surrounded by reminders that her body was not her own. It was a battlefield where the empire secured its victories. Accounts describe how attendants lingered just beyond the chamber, listening for signs that the union had been consummated. Privacy was a luxury denied even to the daughter of a sultan. For the dynasty, this night was not about tenderness or love, but proof of obedience, proof of loyalty, proof that the marriage contract had been sealed in flesh and silence. What truly happened within those walls remains hidden, recorded only in whispers and fragments. Some claim that Fatima trembled so violently her body seemed to resist itself. Others spoke of fainting spells, of bleeding described in coded terms as the soul departing the body. Whether these accounts were exaggerated by gossip or softened by euphemism, they all painted the same truth. This was not the beginning of a marriage, but the collapse of a spirit. For Kara Mustafa Pasha, the night was a victory of another kind. Marriage to a sultan's daughter elevated him closer to the throne, transforming his loyalty into blood bond. His union with Fatima was less personal than political, less passion than protocol. To him, perhaps, she was a key. To her, he was a chain. Witnesses later noted that Fatima's voice all but disappeared after this night. Where once she had spoken with wit and confidence, now her words faltered into whispers, or ceased entirely. Trauma, in its silence, spoke louder than any scream, and so, the chamber that had been adorned with rosewater, silks and jewels, became the scene of an unspoken tragedy. For the empire, it was a triumph. For Fatima, it was the night her childhood ended, her brilliance dimmed, her spirit forced into retreat. The days that followed revealed not celebration, but collapse. Fatima Sultan, once admired for her wit and brilliance, withdrew into silence. Court physicians, whose duty was to soothe the royal household, recorded symptoms with the guarded language of their profession. They noted muteness, loss of appetite, sudden fits of weeping, and violent tremors at the mere presence of men, even eunuchs she had once trusted. In modern terms, we would call it severe trauma, but in their registers it was softened into phrases like nervous weakness or female melancholy. Remedies were attempted, each as elaborate as the empire itself. She was offered infusions of herbs, melissa to calm the heart, lavender for rest, saffron to restore cheer. Musicians played the ney, its hollow flute meant to heal the soul through Sufi melodies. Scholars of mysticism recited verses, guiding her into meditations intended to lift the burden of fear. None of it restored her to the girl she had once been. Her books lay unopened. The instruments she once played gathered dust. The constellations she used to chart were no longer studied, as though the night sky itself had been veiled from her. The laughter that once echoed in gardens was gone, replaced by long silences broken only by tears. In public, she performed her duties as a bride of state. She appeared at ceremonies, seated in embroidered gowns, a silent figure adorned with jewels. But to those who looked closely, she was absent even when present, her eyes clouded with a sorrow that no ornament could disguise. This was the paradox of her new life. The empire had gained stability through her marriage, yet she herself had lost stability entirely. The girl who once shone like a jewel in the dynasty now lived as a shadow within its halls. Even Kara Mustafa Pasha, her husband, seemed to sense the fracture. Though he had secured honor through the marriage, memoirs suggest he increasingly sought refuge in military campaigns and, at times, in opium. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps disinterest, or perhaps his own retreat from a union that had begun not in partnership but in conquest. Fatima remained where duty demanded, a wife in name, a mother in time. But within her, the collapse of that wedding night never truly ended. It lingered, a silence more enduring than words, a grief deeper than ceremony could conceal. In the years that followed, Fatima Sultan's marriage endured, but only in form. The union that had been celebrated with drums, jewels, and fireworks became a hollow arrangement, sustained not by affection, but by politics. She bore children, appeared at courtly ceremonies, and fulfilled the duties expected of a princess. Yet behind the veils and gold embroidery, silence reigned. Her presence at banquets and public rituals was noted by chroniclers, but always in distant terms. The princess adorned with pearls, the consort of Kara Mustafa Pasha. They praised her garments, her jewels, her lineage, but never her words, for she had none left to offer. The girl who once spoke 4 languages and debated scholars had been reduced to a figurehead, her brilliance hidden behind ritual gestures. Meanwhile, her husband sought his refuge elsewhere. Kara Mustafa Pasha, though respected as a commander, drifted further into long campaigns at the frontiers of the empire. Each departure left Fatima more isolated, her chambers filled with silence. When he did return, memoirs suggest a gulf remained between them. He reportedly turned to opium as comfort, perhaps haunted by the shadow of a wife who seemed less a partner than a ghost within his home. Thus, their marriage became mechanical, an arrangement bound by dynastic necessity rather than intimacy. Their lives intersected in ceremonies, in duties, in the presence of children, but rarely, if ever, in shared affection. And yet, Fatima continued to perform her role. She appeared draped in jewels at festivals, bowed when commanded, recited prayers when summoned. To the people, she remained a symbol of the empire's splendor. To those within the palace walls, however, her silence spoke louder than any words. The tragedy of her life was not only in what she suffered, but in how her suffering was concealed. For while her husband sought escape in war and smoke, Fatima herself had nowhere to flee. She lived her days as a living emblem of submission, her voice lost, her spirit dimmed, her marriage a cage disguised as ceremony. The years passed, but time brought no healing. Fatima Sultan's silence deepened into a permanent state. Her brilliance swallowed by an illness the physicians of her age could neither name nor cure. Chroniclers noted that her laughter had vanished, her voice grown faint, her steps unsteady. They spoke of fevers that returned in waves, fainting spells that left her pale as marble, and a quickened pulse that seemed to worsen each year around the anniversary of her marriage. It was as if her body remembered what her voice could no longer tell. Palace doctors prescribed the usual remedies, herbal concoctions brewed from saffron, valerian, and rosewater, spiritual counsel from Sufi mystics who recited verses to soothe her soul, and music played by court musicians, hoping to coax her back into harmony with life. None of it reached her. To outsiders, she remained a dutiful wife and mother, still appearing at courtly ceremonies, draped in silks, her face veiled, her silence mistaken for modesty. But within the palace, those who attended her knew the truth. She lived as a shadow of the child prodigy she once was. Books lay unopened, her instruments untouched, and her eyes, once alive with curiosity, stared into distances no one else could see. Kara Mustafa Pasha, though honored on the battlefield, retreated further into campaigns and the haze of opium. Their marriage, once paraded as a triumph of statecraft, had long since become little more than a facade, an arrangement of appearances. They shared duties but not hearts, children but not intimacy. In 1652, the palace recorded her death. The cause was written as brain fever, a vague diagnosis common in Ottoman registers. Yet the timing sent whispers rippling through the palace. She died on the exact anniversary of her wedding. Too precise, too cruel to be coincidence, some said. To those who remembered her, It was as though her spirit had been broken long before her body gave way, and only the date remained to tell the story. The tragedy of Fatima Sultan was not her death alone, but the long decline that preceded it, a slow unraveling of a once brilliant girl into silence, until the very day she was bound became the day she was released. Fatima Sultan's tragedy was not an isolated tale. Scattered through the dusty ledgers and hidden corners of the Ottoman archives lie faint traces of other imperial daughters, names recorded briefly, then allowed to fade. Some lived in silence, their lives vanishing into the margins of history. Others disappeared altogether, their absence explained away with vague words like illness or withdrawal. Whispers persisted of princesses who took desperate measures. Some were said to have embroidered secret messages into fabrics, coded stitches carrying pleas for freedom to sisters or trusted servants. Others sought divorce, a rare and dangerous act in a court where their worth was measured by obedience. A few stories tell of women who faked their own deaths to escape a second unwanted marriage, vanishing into monasteries or distant estates. Whether fact or legend, these tales reflect the desperation that life in the gilded prison could inspire. Historians suggest that some succumbed to madness or took their own lives, though official records buried such outcomes under euphemisms. In the grand chronicles of the empire, their suffering was erased, replaced by the pageantry of alliances and victories. Yet the truth lingered in rumor, in gossip, in the haunted memories of servants who could not forget. The Ottoman court was not unique in this cruelty. Across Europe, Asia, and beyond, dynastic daughters bore the weight of alliances, their voices silenced beneath crowns and veils. The difference lies in the silence of the archives. How much was concealed, how deliberately suffering was veiled to preserve the illusion of grandeur. Fatima's story opens a window onto that uncomfortable truth, that the empire's magnificence, its towers of gold and its armies of steel, was often built upon the broken spirits of the very women who carried its lineage. For every dazzling ceremony, there was a hidden night of silence. For every chronicle of victory, an unwritten story of loss. And then the inevitable question arises, how many more stories remain hidden? How many princesses, Ottoman, European, Chinese, Russian, lived and died in silence, their names remembered only in coded fragments, in whispers, in rumors? Perhaps history will never tell us, but to listen for them, to bring their voices out of the shadows, is to restore part of what was taken. If the fate of Fatima has unsettled you, let it serve as reminder. The past is not only made of triumphs and crowns, it is also made of silences, and those silences are waiting to be broken.